See? Just reading.
Are you going to do
So I will let you know what my exhibit is showing.
Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you all for coming. I think we're going to get started. I appreciate that you came out on this sort of chilly autumnal evening. Welcome to the Island Lecture Series. This is a program that's been running on and off since the late 80s as part of the Institute of Island Studies. And as we gather here today, it's important for us to respectfully acknowledge the history, spirituality, culture, and rights of all First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people from coast to coast to coast who have called this land home since time immemorial. And this acknowledgement, of course, is nothing without action to back it up. So I encourage all of us to think about ways in which we can actively honor and uphold our obligations in a spirit of true reconciliation. After all, we are all treated people. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Brent Simmers, and I run Island Studies Press, which is part of the Island Studies umbrella, and the Institute's located just down the hall on your way to the washroom. So if you need to get up at any moment and use the washrooms, they're just straight down the hall on the left. There's two, you can use either. The Institute is a research, education, and public policy institute based at UPEI, and you can learn more about it by going onto the website, which is very easy. It's islandstudies.com. We also have an amazing newsletter. If any of you aren't subscribers, I'll be passing around a little sheet. I'm not trying to steal your information, I promise, but you can put your email down, and it has anything from PI community events to calls for papers, conferences, island news from around the world. So it's a great sort of source if you want to get more information about islands. Today, obviously, we're very excited to have Dr. Ed MacDonald with us. And most of you probably don't need an introduction to Ed, but in case there's someone here who does not know him and his work, he's a beloved history professor here at UPEI, and among his 11 books are The Summer Trade, A History of Tourism on Prince Edward Island, co-authored with Alan McEachran, and If You're Strong-Hearted, Prince Edward Island in the 20th Century. He's also the co-editor of Time and a Place, An Environmental History of Prince Edward Island, and one of the other co-editors, Josh McFadgen, is here in the audience tonight. And Ed is also a co-editor of The Greater Gulf, Essays on the Environmental History of the Gulf of St. Lawrence. His lecture tonight is titled Camping in the Backyard, Provincial Park Campgrounds and Island Tourism, 1945 to 2000. So please welcome Dr. Ed MacDonald. We're really
Thank you very much. A disclaimer to begin, I don't like camping. I've never successfully camped. This has not influenced my attitude towards the subject. This is a project that's part of the sabbatical that I'm engaged on, and it's intended for a book that some people that I know and like are trying to assemble, and I want it to be in their book. So even though I don't like camping, I thought I would do something in camping on Prince Edward Island. And another thing I think we should acknowledge is that you are choosing to be here instead of at the Bruce Cockburn concert this evening. And so I've totally redesigned my lecture to orient it around Bruce Cockburn for you. I was going to play Going to the Country. I played it in my office. I'm not sure I could get online. Just kidding. No. This is the lecture. So then again, this is the project this is supposed to be a part of was something that originated during the pandemic, during the lockdown, when a lot of my colleagues in environmental history, and a couple of them here this evening, it's great to see them, couldn't go anyplace. And so the nature they had to contemplate, and in some cases research, was the nature in their backyard. And in other cases, people weren't able to travel to go do the research that they intended. And so the focus on the backyard gave rise to this idea for a book about the nature that's in our backyard. And I said, well, on Prince Edward Island, nature is your backyard. And even though, as I said twice before, I don't like camping, I thought I should do something. Does anyone recognize the campground? Those of you who were here earlier and were told, do you know what we're looking at here?
It looks to me like New Glasgow. But
It is not New Glasgow. Close. It's a provincial park. Josh.
Strathclyde?
It is Strathclyde Provincial Park. Once a campground, but no longer. If you were reading the draft of the text of the chapter, I do point out that this is not a history of camping on Prince Edward Island. There are commercial, private grounds, campgrounds, which have been in operation in some cases for 60 years. But it's a little harder to get at the stats for those. It's a little easier to look at the provincial parks and campgrounds in order to try to trace things like how they change over time. So we'll be talking a little bit about the campgrounds on PEI and specifically more about the provincial ones. So, I also have stolen some images without copyright permission, so. Seal of the confession was what Father Bulger used to say in my history class. The seal of the confession, and what I'm about to tell you. So, there's been a modicum of literature on camping, and much of it centers on the period between the mid-1800s and about the Second World War. And the current argument is that people camped because they lived in North American cities, which were awful places to live. And I piled on as many adjectives as I could think of about what was bad about the city. So depending on the author, people are either fleeing from the city or they're fleeing to nature. And the nature that they're fleeing to is generally a romantic, capital R, view of nature. Awe-inspiring grandeur that stir deep emotions and help restore your physical, mental health and your equilibrium. And generally the authors combine the two. They're fleeing from the city, but they're also drawn to this nature. So I'm saying yes, but, because that's what historians do, try to complicate everybody's simple life. So yeah, but I'm thinking of camping in the post-war period because tourism and camping reached their apogee in the period after the Second World War. That's when most people camped. And I asked myself, why are people camping in the post-war era? Is it to commune with some kind of incarnation of wild nature? And I said, nay, nay, nay. My argument is that people were camping in the post-war period during the democratization of tourism because it was cheaper. Most tourists are baby boomers, many of them with young families or young people without a lot of money. And yes, they may be attracted to nature, but essentially they're camping because it's cheaper. So you can all go home now. That's what the whole chapter's about. It's an earth-shattering sort of a revelation, I understand, which will change your lives. And you'll be going home talking about this over your coffee. Do you know what I learned last night? People camped because it was cheaper. I'm sorry. It's nothing more revelatory than that. But if you do go camping, you'll need a picnic basket. This is not to say that camping to get back to nature, to rough it in nature, was not a thing, and it was in fact a thing on Prince Edward Island, but it was mostly islanders who camped. Here are a couple of images of the typical campsite scene from the late 1800s, early part of the 1900s. Fishing poles, people with their guns, women as well as men who are camping, and there is forest, but if you look really closely, it's basically just a hedgerow. They're in a field, and there's a field in behind them. Because that's the other reality about camping on PEI. There is no wilderness on Prince Edward Island. I'll show you some stats. The wilderness is mostly woodlot. So you can only walk halfway into the woods, then you're walking out. But even when my brother and I were lost for several hours on a June day when I was about 7, we got on lost by walking through a swamp and out the other side of the wood. There's simply, you can get in touch with the outdoors, but nature on PEI is not wilderness. Nature is the outdoors. Now, having grown up in the country, that doesn't mean as much to me as it does to an urban dweller. And so I'm ready to concede that my going is a little unfair to campers. Same time period, setting up camp. They have come with a horse and wagon. And again, as you can see, thick forest behind them. So islanders are camping and they're starting to build rustic cabins. And when they say camping, they often mean actually staying in the cabin. Harry Holman, having attended a version of this talk that I gave earlier, sent me this image from a collection that he had. Certain businessmen in Charlottetown especially would buy access to a pond and they would reserve it to fish. And this was a fishing camp, the Eureka Fishing Camp in Murray River. And in 1926, Judge Aubin Arsenault, the great father, if you will, of the tourism industry in PEI, trying to convince railway magnates to improve the service to Prince Edward Island, lured some of them to Prince Edward Island where they spent a week cut off from the telegraph and the telephone, roughing it in the bush at the camp. This did not start a new tourism trend. But they did get better cars for the passenger service on the railway. They got a Pullman car, maybe several. They didn't encounter Yogi Berra. Well, maybe they did. On Prince Edward Island, if you're a tourist and you're talking camping in the 1920s, you're talking auto camping, which used to be very popular. I didn't realize when I spent a night at the Fiddle Festival in Rollo Bay in the back seat of a Camaro, actually it was a Z28, that I was auto camping. I just thought I wasn't sleeping. Because the drivetrain runs right through the back seat. People would literally camp in their car. And they promoted that on Prince Edward Island to some extent. But in the interwar time frame between 1918 and the Second World War, much of the camping that was done by youth groups, either linked to a church or to a secular organization. And there were campgrounds on Prince Edward Island. I don't know about the amenities on the campground. I think they were relatively basic, but there were regular campgrounds that the YMCA, the Boy Scouts, CGIT would go to camp at. And I did a little partial list that I expect you to memorize in 3 seconds that I show this. Here's a little ad for the YMCA campground in Canoe Cove. But camping in the sense that we think of it as a tourist enterprise really starts with the national park. So the National Park in PEI was established in 1937. Doesn't fit the usual profile of a national park. There are no grand mountains or valleys or vistas, a thin strip of shoreline with some trees. But almost from the beginning, they established some campgrounds so that people who weren't going to stay in cabins or at the resort at Dalvey or other resorts could find a cheap accommodation. That's not what it costs today to go camping. $1 for up to 2 weeks. And here's another shot from 1956. The newspapers in the 50s start talking about this new phenomenon. Trailers. People coming with tent trailers. And they're already here before the newspaper actually noticed. But there they are. And then flash forward 20 years or so, here's the campground in Stanhope. As you can tell, nestled deep in the woods. Yeah, I mentioned 3 campgrounds, then there were 4 campgrounds, then they actually started to provide some more amenities. And so at one point there were 4 campgrounds, now there are 2, I believe. Stanhope and Cavendish. The Rustico Island one has been abandoned, and the one at Dalvey was quite early on and abandoned quite early on. So I'm trying to make a point visually here about the idea of wilderness, which I will reinforce in a nauseating kind of series of slides, details. Trees are used here to frame the image. Same thing here. Because if you're thinking of establishing campgrounds, if you're thinking of establishing provincial parks on Prince Edward Island, you have a challenge. Because the government doesn't really own very much land. Since 1875, most of the island, virtually all of the island, has been in the hands of small freeholders, and the percentage of Crown land, of total land in Canada in Crown land in 1970, 89.5%. Of course, Canada is a big empty country. On Prince Edward Island, if you combine the federal Crown land with the provincial Crown land, 6% of the land mass is available to do something with. As for wilderness, Josh, I need to footnote the information you gave me about your and Bill's article. Up to 70% of the landmass on PEI in 1911 had been cleared for farming. That number got smaller because there's a lot of abandonment of farms between 1920 and 1960. Nevertheless, considerable amount of the island is still classified as in farms in the census of 1951. So how much of that Crown land gets turned into parkland? In Canada, as you can see, the percentage is not very high. On Prince Edward Island, it is can't say that. 0.4%. Infinitesimal? Anyway. Another, I forget which campground this is, but I have a label for it later. Harbor View, I think, because it's looking across at Rustico, North Rustico. So, in the period after 1960, camping becomes the most preferred way of accommodation or on the island. And that surge in camping has to be seen against the surge in tourism. And as you can see, there's an exponential increase in tourism in PEI after the Second World War, but particularly beginning in the 50s and the 60s. You go from 35,000 to 200,000 in a decade, double that in a decade. After that, tourism tends to flatten out and doesn't surge ahead again until the opening of the fixed link, when for the first time it went over 1 million people. By donation and by acquisition, opportunistically, the province started to assemble a series of parks. Some of them are nothing more than a picnic stand by the side of the road, called a wayside park or picnic site. Some of them are provincial parks with substantial acreage and campgrounds. But the implication is that people can camp anywhere, like in your back field. The Boy Scouts came and camped in the mill pond field in our farm. I don't know whether they asked first. It was a field slowly growing back up in bushes, and came by there one day and there were Boy Scouts camping in it for the weekend. As one of the headlines says in The Guardian, tenting jumps in popularity. Pitch tent anywhere is invitation. Sure. Go out to milk the cow. Someone's camping in your yard. Hey, can I get some milk and eggs? Anyway, Prince Edward Price camping unexcelled in eastern Canada. You can pitch a tent almost anywhere with perfect ease. I don't know about legally. So camping ties in with the province's newfound long-term tourism strategy, first invented by Acres Consulting in the mid-1960s, and basically to reduce it to an essence, it was more tourists, staying longer, spending more money, spread out across the province, spread out across the seasons. The provincial park strategy informally tied in with that, because A, the island was scrambling in terms of accommodation as tourism numbers went up, and so it provided a cheap alternative for tourists coming to the island. They also located their parks deliberately near water. Strathgartney is an exception. That's the first ever park. It was a donation from the Cottons, and not the Joseph Cotton of the movies, but actually Robert Cotton. He's a real estate developer. And it was located near a river, but not on the shore. Most of the parks are located near the beach. That's seen as their most attractive kind of feature. And while private camp operators complained bitterly that the provincial park and the federal parks, their campgrounds were competing unfairly with them because they charged ridiculously low rates, the province actually located most of its parks in low tourism areas to use it to try to encourage tourists to spread out across the island and to discourage a competition with the private sector who vote. This is Acre's map showing the location of accommodations, and we could spend a long time looking at it, but we really don't have that much time. But the triangles are the campgrounds. Solid triangle is national. One that's half solid is the provincial, and speckled is private campground. You can see the concentration of accommodations in the central part of PEI. The golden triangle, which includes Summerside up to Cavendish, and then across to the Hillsborough River. And that's where most of the commercial grounds are located. The provincial parks are much more spread out, and none of them are in the North Shore area. And that's quite on purpose. What are they advertising to people? What is the experience that they're trying to sell you? This is actually a postcard showing you the location of all the campgrounds and trailer parks. This is it's a postcard from the second half of the 60s. I couldn't say exactly when it came out. But as you can see, the campgrounds are around the perimeter of the island. The tourism loops that were established by the province also became an avenue to get to the campgrounds. This is what it says on the back side of the campground. Are they promising you an experience of nature? Are they promising you an experience of the great outdoors? No, they're talking about how much is not like camping. No dangerous insects. Well, I got stung by a wasp this summer, but, or wild animals. Apparently, they mean anything larger than a bread box. All campgrounds are supervised. Most are close to towns, villages where the visitor has access to stores, restaurants, theaters, churches, medical help. Some are adjacent to golf and fishing. All provide some form of entertainment. So why do without it? You're not roughing it. You're close to all of the pleasures of home. Same message in this. This is the backside of Vacation Travel Park, which was in Brackley Beach. Look at all of the amenities they're advertising. Stately white birch trees, blah, blah, blah. Open, shaded, and wooded sites. Laundromat, hot showers, playground. Has anyone ever had a shower at a campground? Is there any more miserable experience? Amenities, yeah, possibly a dormitory. It's like, I would rather not. So now I'm going to show you some postcards from the time period, so that we can see what the campgrounds actually look like to go with the captions. Strathgartney. Now, in behind Strathgartney is a fairly substantial wooded area sloping down to the West River. They don't show you that. They show you the pastoral rolling farmscape of PEI. And that guy in the impossibly tight big truck. Cavendish. Located in a wooded area inside the national park, but it looks like Sherwood or something. It's all very suburbanized. Here's Stanhope. not quite as wooded, and yet surrounded by civilization. Harbor View Campground, which I showed you earlier. Summer Haven Campground. It's not just that they're not showing you a kind of wilderness environment, it's that they don't intend to pretend that it's anything other than camping in an open field or under a tree. The Rainers operated this campground, established in 1959, now Crystal Shore? Yeah, the Crystal Beach. The one that got flooded, I think, several years ago during a storm surge. Trees are there for shade and privacy. And they are actually related to you, right, Laurie? Yeah. This is possibly my favorite. This literally is a campground in some farmer's backyard. Right in behind the barn and not far from the Northumberland Strait. Trails End in Hampton. Not unlike cottage suburbs that we find in lots of places on PEI.
No trees out.
No, no. Here's Stanhope Bay Road Camping, run by the Jenkins family, one of the bitterest of the complainers about the competition from the national park. They wanted the national park to close its campgrounds entirely. And with some reason, campgrounds at the national park were at capacity virtually all summer. Places like this, in the high season, would come 50 to 70 or so %. And in the extremities of PEI, some of the campgrounds had an occupancy as low as 6%. So people are camping close to the national park, and if they can, in the national park. So they have a complaint. The Jenkins family do have a complaint. And this is a postcard. Highlight of my visit to Prince Edward Island, the food market. Holiday Haven. I've never actually been there, but I used to see the sign all the time, and I thought it must be pretty splendid. And faux Gaelic campground names. Dunworkin. I think, ooh, how Gaelic is that? I think, oh yeah, Dunworkin. I don't know what Denali may actually be Gaelic. This cartoon has actually nothing to do with the point I'm trying to make. I just thought it was funny. Having recently flown. So, visual evidence suggests that nature, wilderness is not part of the camping experience, nor is it intended to be. What they're selling is convenience. Well, surveys said in 1975, actually the report was made in 76, the survey was done the previous year, they interviewed thousands of campers about all kinds of things, including, why are you camping? And the number one answer, we could have done a Family Feud type thing, the number one answer, because it's cheaper. The number two answer was, because people like the outdoors. But I'm discounting that because it doesn't fit my argument as well. The number one answer. And most of the campers are off-island.
So, Ed, why do you think the off-island percentage is so much higher than the island percentage?
That the island percentage of, you mean?
So 50%,
Yeah.
so 20% higher.
I don't know, maybe it's because Charlottetown is such an oppressive urban environment. I can't explain that, Colin. But island campers are a much lower sort of a component. They're only 16.6 or so %. And that's still the number one answer, is because it's cheaper. But I think they're not investing in a vacation that's going to last you for 2 weeks. Typically, a tourist coming to Prince Edward Island was coming to Prince Edward Island on a swing through the region, as opposed to coming just to PEI. Some people did, but typically they're traveling through the Maritimes, and so cheap accommodation becomes more important than my hockey team deciding to camp in Cavendish overnight on Saturday night. And we are camping because it's cheaper. And
Was one of the factors the fact that some city dwellers wanted to get out of the city for a while?
yeah, I mean, Terrence Young, who's written the most elaborate work on camping in the United States, his main argument is that people are fleeing from the city, and as you'll see later on, his argument for why camping went into a decline is that the city became a less oppressive place to live. So people were not as needful of escape. So they're connecting with nature, and they're also getting out of the city. But that, I was making a joke that on PEI, the city is never as oppressive as Cincinnati or Pittsburgh or New York. So I think it's mostly a cost thing. Islanders who camp are only camping overnight or for a couple of nights, whereas if you're a family on vacation, you're watching your pennies because you're going to be staying someplace for 2 weeks while you drive from Toronto through the region. But they didn't break that down.
Isn't that possible, Doc, because Islanders go to their cottages, which are like 2 kilometers away from where they live?
Yeah. Or they go home to the homestead.
Well, that is true, but the question posed was why the percentage of people camping because it's cheaper
Right.
was smaller among Islanders. So it's the sample of those who choose to camp. Obviously, a lot of people are voting not to camp because they have a cottage.
They have a cottage, they built their cottage, right?
So yeah, I suppose in a reverse way, that does affect motivation, because you're not camping because it's cheaper, because if you were going to camp because it's cheaper, you're staying in the 2x4 shack that you call a cottage.
So a lot of the people where I am in Clinton, but moving out toward Malpeque, their cottages run near Cabot Park and Cabot Beach and Cabot, and they have the campground there. and
This is
so-
another issue, actually, Mike, that goes to a larger topic, which I'm not really qualified to comment on based on my research as much. Cottage development has mushroomed in the last 30 or 40 years. So that is possibly taking away from islanders who camp. I don't think it's taking away from tourists who camp, but possibly. There used to be not nearly so many cottages. I mean, now, if you got in a canoe and you canoed around the island today, there is a necklace of summer homes. Virtually every part of the shore is cottages now. And that just was not true 50 years ago. So there's something in that, Michael, but I can't speak
I'm
to it
thinking
with
of
authority.
my own experience now that I've asked the question. So we had a cottage in Montague, lived in Charlottetown, but we went camping probably twice in those years. But of course, we wouldn't be doing that for cheapness. It was just a different experience.
For the experience.
Yeah, because we had a cottage which was cheaper than,
So recall you had a boat too, didn't
and we
we?
had a boat too.
Yes. Visiting the Caplins, I think it's the first time I met you. Classifications of provincial parks. So the province has acquired ad hoc a network of parks. And they're trying to figure out how to most efficiently use them. Because to staff all of the parks is very expensive. To maintain all of the parks is expensive. And they're getting complaints from private operators that the provincial campgrounds are competing unfairly. So they're hiking entrance fees until they're actually pretty much on a par with the commercial sites. They're also trying to, because this is now the era of the development plan, where everything is being rationalized, everything is being modernized and planned. So they decide on classifications of parks, which would have been great if they had actually stuck with them. But they're now thinking in terms of nature. Tourism Department was renamed the Department of Environment and Tourism in the early 70s. And versions of that for about 8 or 9 years. Now, their idea about environment often involved getting the litter out of the beaches and stopping people from putting up signs and billboards. But they're also beginning to think in terms of the fact that what nature there is on Prince Edward Island needs to be preserved and protected. So they start classifying parks. And there are ultimately about 40 sites on PEI that are classified as parks. Not all of them officially are campgrounds. By the mid-70s, there are about 25 of them that are officially a campground, and the others where people used to camp are now no longer available for camping. But you have the nature preserve where there is no camping, limited access, natural environment park where the campsites are supposed to complement but not destroy that landscape, the recreation park, which is where you can go and have fun and camp, and then access to the beach or just essentially a picnic area. And then you have the kind of historic park, such as Orwell Corner, the fisheries park, you know, the one at Basin Head, which is really a museum, not the Provincial Park. But so they have a classification, neat, well thought out. They didn't really stick to it. The national park had always wrestled, as Alan, my colleague Alan McCachran has said, always wrestled with the fact that PEI National Park didn't fit the prototype of a national park. It was small and it was densely used. You know, actually the visitation at the national park on the island led the country in the 60s. More people went there than to any other park, yet it's the smallest park. And it doesn't have wilderness, it has beach and a thin screen of woods. So in the 1970s, they start trying to return to this natural history mandate. And so these are French language brochures about camping at Cavendish. And there is an appeal to nature. This is apparently a muskrat. Either that or a very large rat. Okay. And this is, I think, a fox, although it looks like a coyote, and maybe it's a foreshadowing of the fact that the coyote is about to arrive on PEI. That's the other point about nature on PEI that's reassuring for tourists, is that it's a soft nature. You're not going to get attacked and eaten by a grizzly bear. You're not in danger. So the nature is very manageable and controlled, and the encounters are generally pleasurable. So I'm just kind of skipping over what takes some time in the text. Visitation at provincial parks goes over 1 million people a year in 1975. And after that it declines. And while the statistics are not uniformly available, camping declines, particularly in the 1980s. And the number of campgrounds, after hitting a peak in 1972, slowly declines. Now, some of those campgrounds that close are smaller campgrounds, so we would have to look at the number of campsites, and there's no consistent listing of the number of available campsites, so I couldn't do a graph of that or a table of that. But the provincial park strategy on the part of the province is increasingly focusing on developing a handful of parks, while other parks are neglected. And the number of campgrounds at provincial parks declines as well. But overall, the camping industry sees a decline in the number of campgrounds. So this is overall, not just the provincial campgrounds. So some of the trends I've identified, particularly there's a wave of park closures in 1986-87. When the press is all about revitalizing the provincial park system. And the reality is that they're actually closing parks. They're rationalizing their parks. Because according to the minister, and he didn't provide the statistics, between 1981 and 1987, camping had declined by 40% at provincial parks. Not necessarily at the commercial private parks. So the province, resources in the post-development plan era are more strapped. It develops a handful of parks, particularly Cabot Park in the western part of PEI, Red Point in the Basin Head area. Later on, they're going to invest quite a bit of money actually at Basin Head itself. Some parks were closed. Some parks were privatized. They turned them over to the private sector, and some parks were turned into just a day-use parks. Strathgartney is an example of that. This is Strathgartney in the background here. And so that's why you see this drop in the number of campgrounds. So, fewer people appear to be camping on PEI. I heard the statistics from, in the beginning they don't make any kind of difference between a campground and like park that's only just, so I presume they expect people will camp in any of the parks. But later on they want facilities and amenities. So anyway, the number of campgrounds declines from 22 in 1970, I think get up to as high as 25, although I couldn't find the stat for the lecture tonight, down to 13. Parks in total drop from 40 down to 27. Stats always seem so solid, as if that proves something. The way they keep stats varies. In the beginning they're talking about, I saw the permit. Later on it's nights that were booked for camping. So camping figures reach, where I have stats, they reach a peak in 1976, and then they don't regain that total again until 1999, but look at it as a percentage of people who are coming to PEI. Twice as many people are coming. So even though the camping numbers look really good, the rate is considerably lower. So why are people not camping? Why are fewer people camping? Terrence Young says there are a number of reasons. He also points out that camping peaked in the late 20th century in terms of the rate of the number of people who are camping as a fraction of the population, percentage of the population. Absolute numbers go up, but the population is going up faster, so again, fewer of the proportion of the population are camping. And he says it's because today's youth, they're sedentary and rather be on their phone, they're not going out and doing things. But also, his major argument is that the city is no longer as unhealthy and oppressive a place to live. So people aren't fleeing from the city anymore. And I say, yes, but, and this I can't prove, but logically, if people are camping in the 60s and 70s, they're baby boomers, and they're camping, they say, because it's cheaper. Well, once your children have grown up and left home and you've established yourself and you have no more money, you don't have to camp anymore. You only camp because you choose to camp. Because, like the McFadden family, for example, you like camping. Inexplicable as that is. They can afford not to camp. And camping actually revives on Prince Edward Island in the late 1990s. And the government stats say, whoa, camping is on the upswing again. But it's not the same kind of camping, because now baby boomers who decide to camp, they want comfort. They don't want to rough it in the bush, wake up with a sore back, even though they had an air mattress. So provincial park system does not grow again. There are fewer provincial parks than ever. In 1999, as we saw in an earlier stat, there were 27. Now there are 20. 13 of them had a campground. Now only 8. And I looked at the brochure online website illustrating all the campsites. Not a single one chose a tent. But what you will find is in the 2000s a surge in the popularity of glamping. So camping in comfort. And of course, the RV. The provincial park not far from where I have a cottage was going to be converted to a day-use park, and the community objected vociferously, and a local group took it over and turned it into a privately run campground, except that it is full of RVs. So what is the difference between living in an apartment and living in an RV? The RV moves. Are you camping? I don't think so.
So Doc, what is the impact of a place like Twin Shores on all this thing? Because Twin Shores is what, how many campers lined up in a row?
People still camp.
Lots of, but
I'm not saying people don't camp.
those are campers though, right? In other words, it's your summer life.
Yeah, oh,
Camping
there are
campers.
RV parks, there are articles in The Guardian about communities of people that come back year after year and they camp in the same RV park and they know their neighbors and it's just like living in a freaking suburb.
For a few months, right?
Yeah.
In the summer.
And that's great, but it's a different kind of camping. So my argument is that while camping has seen a revival, it is camping that reflects the aging demographic of people who want comfort in camping. And so they either glamp or they have an RV. And it's the stalwart minority of campers who rough it in the bush with their tent and their sleeping bag and their air mattress, and I have nothing but admiration for them. And that's really all I had to say. Susan?
So at one point, if I have this right, you were saying that in terms of camping, the national park camps were book solid and then others.
Yeah, 97 or so % capacity
Do you
in
think,
the high season.
even though the national park is not wilderness, do you think that still the appeal is that people sort of have the image that somehow this is going to be more authentic than, you know, Twin Shores, or is it just cheaper, or is it just about marketing? Like, is there an appeal that you're going to be in the national park that somehow is going to be a more authentic camping experience?
Yeah,
Particularly if you're from off-island.
I'm going to speculate because I haven't, if I was going to do more research on camping in the national park, and one would have to probably spend some time in Ottawa and encroach on Allen's turf. I think there are people who camp in national parks. So they travel across the country and they choose to camp in national parks. I think partly because they feel that there's a consistency, or partly because it's just a thing. So we camp in Fundy Bay National Park, and we go Cape Breton Highlands National Park, Terra Nova, etc. So there's some of it is that. Some of it is the simple, I mean, the national park campgrounds are no longer much cheaper than the commercial parks, which was a real problem in the early days. So it's not, I don't think it's so much cost. I think it may be in their imagination, if they're camping in national parks, the other national parks are more wilderness parks, so they come to PEI, and the national park they assume will be like other national parks, and it turns out that it's not, but, so it may be that. I don't think it's because it's cheaper, it may be proximity though. What are the big attractions in PEI? Where do most tourists go? The most popular thing that they do is sightsee. They drive around and look at the countryside. But far and away, the majority of people end up on the North Shore. So the commercial campgrounds on the North Shore get more people than the commercial campgrounds in the East and the West, because they're close to the North Shore, and the national park is a major attraction. So if you're choosing between getting to stay right in the national park, which is your destination, or nearby, maybe you choose the national park. And maybe there's a perception at the time that you can be guaranteed a certain level of quality, which you're not necessarily going to get in the 1970s and 80s in a commercial campground, even though many of them are very well appointed. But it's harder to know that. Now you can go online and find someone's rating of what's it like at Crystal Beach.
What about camps having, within their own private camps, having a camping area like Sunset has a place where you can camp in a tent?
Oh, all of them do.
All of them do, right?
All of them
Instead
do.
of-
And there are people who still like to pitch a tent and camp.
And where does a place like Green Park fall into all this?
Green Park Provincial Campground closed.
Is closed?
Yeah, I think they privatized it.
I see.
I haven't been up there since that happened. When I was in charge up there, there was a provincial park.
I have a lot of damage from every hurricane since Dorian, I think, really, in there. But then there is a part, if you drive through enough, you'll hit like a lake or something like that. And there's a lot of small cabins or,
That's at Green Park.
yeah, I think so.
It wouldn't be, I don't think, well, I said,
Private place then perhaps?
I haven't been up to the park part in quite a long time. Yeah, that wasn't part of my research. I didn't try to visit every campground in PEI and camp there. Now, Alan McCacken, when he was doing his work on national parks, actually cycled around and visited and camped at all the national parks, which was, I thought, an incredible investment on his part of scholarly, well, I don't know what you're saying, a muscle. But I have not.
So how far forward are you going here? Impact of Airbnbs now too?
I'm only going to 2000.
Oh, okay, so that's.
The recent
not
past
yet.
is too recent.
Right,
You can't
okay.
see
Sorry.
the contours of the past
Right,
unless you get some distance. So I arbitrarily stopped at 2000.
okay.
Does anyone here operate a campground? By any chance? I just didn't, because I'd be really interested in knowing current views about how hard it is to make a living from a campground. In the 1970s, someone did a master's on camping on PEI, and they concluded that it was not commercially viable in terms of the return on investment to establish a private campground.
Well, Josh, shift my question right now toward that then. You make a convincing case really for the decline of the number of campgrounds, and it seems like the number of nights that people are staying at campgrounds, with some exceptions, right? But it's not following the arc of tourism for sure. It's going the other way. And I wonder if you could reflect on, you know, those economic challenges, or I guess the organizational challenges of running a campground. Because I am going to reflect on the last couple of years and say, in my history, and as you know, I love camping, taking the kids pretty well every year all around North America. We have a really hard time booking sites. They seem to be almost always at capacity. So if you're in Ontario, Lake Huron, the Pinery, very famous campground, provincially run, right? Always full. People book it, like they wake up in the morning on the day that it opens in February to book their site in June. Same with a lot of the national park campgrounds, especially Kejimkujik, and anyone that's got like a really kind of niche attractions of canoeing and Keji. If you don't book it in February, you might get a spot on Labor Day, and that's it. Like they're at capacity. So I'm wondering if from a campground operator's perspective, you really need to keep it at capacity, or you're losing money and.
Well, that is a problem. The camping, the season for camping on PEI, if you're relying on people coming to PEI as a tourist camp, the camping season is quite short, because people don't come as tourists in May up to mid-June, and they don't still come much in October, even after Labor Day. And that's partly because we're a family vacation spot, despite all the efforts to appeal to the dinks, like people with a double income and no kids. Despite all of that effort, camping season is narrow. So
But it's probably narrow everywhere, because if you're camping with kids, you can only do it in the school break.
Yeah, that is true.
2 months off.
And it may well be, I don't, as I said, if one was plugged into, I suppose, a North American camping network, you could find out why PEI is, or is it less attractive as a campsite. I find it curious that the PEI National Park has closed some campgrounds. So there are fewer places to camp, fewer sites to camp in than there were in the 1960s. Yeah, and again, part of that involves Parks Canada's concern for its wilderness mandate, but also Robinson Island has environmental issues. I camped actually on Robinson's Island with my hockey team in 1979 or so. But I don't have current statistics, because I stopped in 2000, for whether campgrounds in PEI are at their capacity. Certainly in 1975, when there's a study done, a lot of the campgrounds are well below capacity if you stretch it out over the whole season.
I think on PEI they keep them pretty full.
In the like July, August?
Yeah, you can't book the week before and find the spot.
I know the one in Murray Harbor.
Yeah,
Kings,
you need to book well in advance.
you need to book all in advance.
Yeah.
Twin Shores, the exact same thing. So as people drive out of Twin Shores, that's your one shot to book again for the next year on the same dates. And then they don't open booking again until, I don't know, March.
So what it does seem to me as if that the commercial sites, whether by design or accident, are managing to curb the number of campsites to the demand, so that you don't have a lot of empty sites.
It does seem like that.
But as I said, because I didn't want to come too close to the present, I can't tell you what the more recent stats are. I could tell you what the trends were after the 2000s, or the beginning of the 2000s. So it's a little bit hard to say what's happening now. But there are some new campgrounds that have opened.
Well, that thesis in 1970 said that it was on...
Yeah, that the amount of money that you had to invest and the shortness of the season. And he was looking at the capacity and the rates of people who actually came to camp, and concluded that it was a dicey enterprise. And he was a student. I think his father was a professor at UPEI, to be honest with you, looking at his last name, and he worked as a summer job in a campground in Summerside. But he was going to the University of, I think, in Michigan. So I mean, why is there an MA thesis about camping on PEI at the University of Michigan? And then he was like, Galloway. Is there an Ian Galloway who taught at UPEI? So I'm now convinced it was his son. But yeah, his conclusion, and this was a master's thesis, so I don't want to put too much on the lad's acumen, but yeah, that it would be $150,000 to develop a campsite of at least, I forget how many sites, 100 or 200 campsites.
There's more money,
And provide the amenities that people require.
more money per acre in potatoes than university.
But it is, again, there are two aspects to the argument. One is that people are camping because it costs less. The other is that people are not camping for wilderness experience on PEI because you can't. They're camping because for them, nature is equivalent to the outdoors, which is viable, but it's different than the literature just tends to think about people in the Adirondacks and the Rocky Mountains and the Canadian Shield and parking on the edge of or within the wilderness. And on PEI, you're camping in an open field. And so, anyway, I think it's easier to prove that because you have all the evidence of the visuals than it is to prove that in the 2000s, people are still camping for this or that reason. Except that camping... I will also say that camping stats get skewed because so many of the tourists who come to PEI come from the Maritimes. That's still where the bulk of our tourists are from. So if it's a miserable, cold, wet summer, they don't say, let's go camp for the weekend in Cavendish. They stay home. And the camping stats, as a result, tend to be variable from year to year based on weather. So, but if you look at long-term trends, you definitely see a decline in the number of campgrounds. And some recognition of that in the official records or documents in the newspaper reports. I think the minister claiming that camping is down 40%, I did the math on the stat that I had and it was 28%. But he was making an argument in the legislature to defend an action they had taken. So he was probably exaggerating.
Isn't it possible that our campgrounds that are provincial or I guess federal or whatever, or have not evolved with the way people picture a private campground or personal? Like, I mean, I did have some years' experience at Sunset because of family. Okay, and
but your email talked about all the drinking.
Only on the night of the Cavendish Music Festival.
Oh, right.
Saturday night.
Sorry.
The rest of it is hit or miss. But what I'm trying to say is they're a place to, like, if I had children, that's where I would go, right? In other words, my children, what I was saying to, part of it was his children freedom. You could play bingo when, we can't do that at the cabin park, for sure. Okay, but I mean, you see it
Are you
plays.
thinking of that as a child activity though, or for the adults?
Oh, well, adults play too, so do the children. But what I'm trying to say is it's a mix and you talk about expense to run a place though, because you need a rec director, right? You need security, you need maintenance, you need all sorts of stuff. Okay, to run a place like Sunset. However, Sunset definitely plays to family.
But I think like you put your finger on why one of the trends in the Provincial Park was to put their eggs in fewer baskets. Because to provide the kind of amenities that the campers are looking for, you have to invest more money. So you can't do that across the board. They have too many sites, and some of them are not even staffed. There's even a site in Newport, in a stretch of ground where they used to haul up all the fishing boats at the end of the season and put them there for the winter. The province acquired that. They put in a swing set and some horseshoe posts or something and said, oh, here's a wayside park. Someone mowed the lawn, and that's the only investment ever made in that park. And it was eventually, apparently still owned by the province. So if you have too many sites, you've got to pick and choose, especially when the demands of tourists for amenities become more refined. So if you still like being outdoors, but you have money and you're going to camp, you want showers where the hot water is hot. You want the swimming pool. You want the playground. You want the activities. Not just having them close by. You know, just down the road, there are churches and bingo halls. Hard to find a bingo hall in PI, actually. It's another article someone could write about the decline of bingo. Other forms of gambling have taken over from bingo, is my theory. I'm diverting attention from the subject at hand. So, thank you so much for the feedback and asking questions I can't answer. So it's like I'll never get elected at this rate. Ben, I'll turn it back over to you.
Yeah, so if
Thank
there
you
aren't
so
any
much.
last questions, let's go and pause. Thank you, Ed. I learned a lot, and
That's good.
I'm a camper, and so we can have a private conversation, continue this discussion. I know there's lots of thoughts in our head. This video will be up on our website, so along with all of our other lectures, they're up there. We have another lecture coming up on the 21st, November 21st, and Susan Graham talking about branding and islands. So that should be really interesting.
And Susan is a lively speaker. It'll be well worth your time.
Fantastic. So hope to see you then, and thanks so much for coming out.
Thanks.
Have a good night.
Thank you.